there is a forbidden book, lost for centuries, that includes fallen angels, bloodthirsty giants, and a warning to all humanity.
The Book of Enoch is a highly controversial and convoluted subject, enveloped in a dizzying haze of Ethiopian tradition, occultic mythology, esoteric mysticism, and uneducated assumption. The personage of Enoch himself is ambiguous at best, leading many people to conjure up wild speculations concerning who he was, where he went, and what exactly he wrote. Though the Bible reveals very little about Enoch, the writer of the book of Jude boldly quotes verbatim from one of the works ascribed to him. The argument of whether or not the book of Enoch should be canonized and included in the Bible is irrelevant. The only question we should be asking is whether or not the book of Enoch is true. Could it be that we are the generation who will be living in the day of tribulation when all the wicked and godless are to be removed? If so, then the book of Enoch, written in the dawn of humanity, is addressed to us who are living in the twilight.
The Book of Enoch is, again, when scholars talk about it, they're referring to something called First Enoch. There's actually 3 books of Enoch, but the first one is the one that gets all the attention, and for good reason. It was something that circulated really widely in the intertestamental period, again, what scholars call the Second Temple period. And so it would have been a book read by Jesus and read by the apostles, the New Testament writers, and any Jew that sort of read stuff in the Second Temple period would know about Enoch and would know the contents, the storyline, and so on and so forth about this book. Now, for us, our evidence of this book only goes back to about the 3rd or 2nd century BC.
It may have been the first written manuscript in terms of a prophecy that was written down and passed on, that was literally addressed to the last generation, the generation that will be living in the end.
And isn't that amazing that our generation is the generation where the Book of Enoch is getting more and more popular?
And this seems to be the time in which it's resurfacing, and there are proofs coming out that are pointing to the fact that indeed it is as old as we think it is.
It is an ancient writing filled with divine secrets, dreams, and visions. A tour of heaven and hell, guided by the angel Uriel. The Book of Enoch is named for the man who the Holy Bible says walked with God.
Enoch walked with God after the birth of Methuselah 300 years, and had other sons and daughters. Thus all the days of Enoch were 365 years. Enoch walked with God, then he was no more, because God took him.
This is one of those curious stories in the Old Testament that we kind of look at and just kind of go, like the Genesis 6, 1 through 4, okay, giants, okay, we'll just kind of file that away as one of those curious little things that doesn't really matter to us today. Enoch, of course, one of 2 Old Testament, patriarchs who were brought up to heaven without dying. So just from that alone, you'd assume there was something significant about it. How important was the Book of Enoch considered to the writers who lived during the time of the New Testament, the authors of the New Testament?
In the academic world, scholars spend a lot of time on Enoch and its relationship to the New Testament. Because you would think, and again, I've read this in Christian books, we shouldn't even think about the Book of Enoch because the New Testament never quotes it, New Testament never bothers with it. That's just false. That's just wrong. It is quoted very clearly in 1 or 2 places, but there are dozens of allusions to the material, to the storyline in particular, in this book. And so it really leaks into some New Testament passages in fascinating ways. The one that's kind of the most obvious is when Peter and Jude write about the angels that sinned. And again, there's no other candidate for that phrase other than the Genesis 6, 1 through 4 incident. The whole idea of, the third of the angels being swept down in a rebellion. And you get that in Revelation 12, again, the last book of the Bible. You get that in Revelation 12, but that event is cast in connection with the first coming of Jesus, the birth of the Messiah. So there's a war in heaven in connection with that. So this idea that this is primeval is largely something that comes from like Paradise Lost, Christian tradition. You don't actually have, biblical precedent for this. But Peter and Jude are writing about the angels that sin, and they use certain lines that come from Enoch, certain ideas. The angels that are kept in gloomy darkness, chained in gloomy darkness, prisoned in the abyss. Well, you don't read that in Genesis 6:1-4 or anywhere else in the Old Testament. Where you do read it is books like First Enoch in the intertestamental literature. Now, it's true that you get, again, the disembodied spirits of the giants, okay, the immaterial version of the Rephaim in Sheol, in the underworld. You get that in the Old Testament. But some of the specific language that Peter and Jude, offer, especially when in Peter's case, he uses a verb tartarao, to be kept in Tartarus. That's a very specific allusion to the Titan story, which is the secular Greek.
Oh, yes.
It's the secular Greek version of what Enoch is writing. So that's probably the most blatant example of where it's not quoted explicitly, but there are absolutely clear themes in Enoch that show up in the New Testament writings.
Titanomachy would be the same as what in biblical terms?
There's actually two versions of the Titanomachy in ancient Greek literature, and one of them is very close again to the Genesis 6:1-4, the Watcher story, the sin of the Watchers, and that's actually what I focus on in the book, because the specific episode where you have the sin of the Watchers, which is Enoch's language for Genesis 6:1-4, the sons of God cohabiting with the daughters of men, producing Nephilim. That episode is really dealt with in 1 Enoch 6-15. So 9 chapters, and they're all very short, so it's not a whole lot of material, but that episode is really important for New Testament writers, because in Jewish theology of the day, if you asked a Jew, hey, why is the world the mess that it is? Why is human depravity so bad? They wouldn't answer you like a Christian would today. A Christian would say, oh, that's the fall. Well, a Second Temple Jew would say, well, yeah, the fall's an issue because there we have the first, entrance of sin into God's good world. But the real culprits here are the Watchers, because in the Watcher's story, and also it's true in the story that's behind Genesis 6 from Mesopotamia, that the writer of Enoch knew, what the real problem is when the Watchers sin like this, they also teach humanity lots of things that corrupt humanity. And so if you asked a Jew, hey, why are people so bad? What's up with depravity? They would say, well, it kind of got started with the garden, but the real impact is the sin of the Watchers. And so you have that idea, kind of the proliferation of evil being laid at the feet of the Watchers. That idea is picked up in several passages in the New Testament that you'd never really know. It's kind of lurking under the surface, unless you kind of knew what you were looking for. If you had read Enoch, you'd know that.
Not just the Titan story, but also gets into Prometheus.
Yeah. The whole. I mean, there are some pretty interesting counterparts picked up on in the quote Greek mythology, or the Greek stuff that isn't related to the Bible, isn't a translation of the Bible, that kind of thing. But yeah, you get clear touch points with that kind of material, and it all goes back to earlier days. Whoever wrote Enoch very clearly knew the real backstory of Genesis 6:1-4, and that is the Mesopotamian story of the Apkallu. Because there are things in Mesopotamian literature in those stories that show up also in Enoch. So again, it's very clear that whoever wrote that knew not only the Old Testament, Genesis 6:1-4, but also knew the more ancient backstory that Genesis 6:1-4 was responding to. Again, sort of shooting theologically at some specific points of Mesopotamian religion. So whoever wrote Enoch knew all that stuff and puts it all together in their work, and then Peter and Jude and other New Testament writers, dip into it either quotation-wise or allusion-wise. And so you actually get, it sounds really odd, but you actually get in a Jewish work from the time of Jesus, you get preserved the original context for why Genesis 6:1-4 is even in the Bible.
This version of the fall of the angels was very popular in its day and maintained popularity for centuries to come. When we look at Dante's work